Now we talked about integer. As we said before, integer is just a number. Of course, as a number, as a bucket, as we said before, the analogy, it has its limitations, right? So it has a size as everything else in the world, right? Everything has its capacity. All right, so we're going to move on, and in the realm of numbers, the next thing we are going to learn about is another type of number called long. So if int is a smaller bucket, every time we want something bigger than an integer, meaning if we want the capacity of our bucket to be a bigger number, we will use what we call a long. Now, this is not used very often, but every now and then you will see it being used in applications, so forth, right? So to create a long, we say long as that, and let's say this is going to be the weight of planet, and I'm going to give it something like this, right? Okay, so as you can see, this is a way bigger number than what we have here, right? So let's see, 3, 6, 3, 6, 9. So as you can see, this is a way bigger number than what we have here, which is wonderful because, like we said, long carries bigger numbers without any issues. All right, so anytime we want to add a bigger number, you would use long. So always think in these terms. Int will take really big numbers. So in most applications, like we said before, you're probably going to be fine with just an integer. But in cases you will see, or cases that you would need a long, so a bigger bucket, you would use a long. Okay, very good. Now the other number type that we can use for decimal points is what we call a float. So there are times that we want to express something like 1.2 or I don't know, 4.4 or even 0.2, something like that. So all of these are decimal numbers. Okay, to do that, there is also a specific type in Java. I hope you can see now that there is this recurring theme in Java that everything has to be explicitly declared, right? So in this case here, for float, we can say float. So this is the other type of number. So I can say float pi, and I can give it 3.14 like this. Okay, now you notice that we have an issue here. If you hover over, it says incompatible because it says required float found double. Now, this is very interesting. So I did this on purpose because I wanted to show. So because in Java, there's two kinds of, let's say, floats. Okay, there is the float and there is a double. So the difference here is that double is bigger than the float, right? So in Java, the distinction between a float and a double, as you see here, syntactically speaking, is not that different, right? Because it's all about the size and the memory. But in terms of the syntax, 3.4 could be a float, but also could be a double. So in Java, if you want to express a float number, you would usually just put an F like that, and then it would be read as a float. So every time we want to create a float in Java, it's recommended to just put an F after that so that the compiler knows that you're talking about a float specifically, not a double, because a double would be another kind of float, but a bigger bucket, if you will. Just like we have int is a number, but so is a long. But int is smaller in capacity than it is a long. So the same difference here, right? So now if we want to create a double, we can just go and say double pi again. In fact, let's say pi d, so to differentiate what we had before. And I can do the same thing, 3.14 like that. You notice we have no problem. So every time we want to use a double, you don't have to put d here to signify a double or so. Although I think sometimes you can do that. So we're not required to put, let's say, a d like this, right? Very good. So now it knows this PID is a double. That is the small difference that can be a little bit confusing at first. Okay, so if I take this pi here and put here, of course, as you very well know, if you run this, we should see 3.4. Okay, same thing, PID. Let's put a D there and run again. We should see 3.4 again. So you see the distinction here is literally meaningless because whatever we look at it, the number is the same. But the compiler will know that this is a float and this is a double because it will read in and know exactly what we're talking about here because we say 3.4 is F for float. Okay, very good. That is the distinction between a float, a double, and of course the long. So every time you want big numbers, of course, you int, which is what we're going to be using the most. If you want bigger numbers, you're going to go and use long. Okay, and if you want decimal numbers, you will use float. If you want a little bit bigger decimal numbers, right, and that has more precision as well, bigger with more precision, right? So if you are creating an application that needs to be precise in terms of the numbers, the decimal numbers, you would always use double. Okay, so you'll see this be using for currency and other calculations that need that precision. Okay. All right, very good. I'll see you in the next video.